The book of Numbers is where the biblical system stops pretending that its goal is to form people and starts revealing that its real concern is managing them. Up to this point, the narrative can still be framed as developmental. Genesis explains what's wrong with humanity. Exodus explains who's in charge. Leviticus explains the rules. But Numbers is where the patience runs out. Formation gives way to discipline. Relationship gives way to regulation. If Genesis breaks you by defining you as flawed from the start, if Exodus controls you by redefining freedom as obedience to a new authority, and if Leviticus monitors you by turning your body, behavior, and proximity into moral risks, then Numbers is where you are disciplined. This is not a story about wandering in the desert. That framing is very misleading. Numbers is not about geography or spiritual journeying. It's about resistance. It's about what happens when a population does not comply quickly enough, gratefully enough, or quietly enough. The wilderness is not a testing ground for growth, it's a containment zone for dissent. In Numbers, the basic human responses to fear, hunger, exhaustion, and uncertainty are no longer treated as understandable reactions. They are reclassified as rebellion. Questioning leadership becomes treason. Expressing doubt becomes moral failure. Survival itself becomes conditional, not on justice, not on care, but on alignment. The community is no longer treated as a collective of people navigating hardship together. It's treated as a compliance problem that must be solved. This is where the logic of punishment fully replaces the logic of persuasion. Problems are not addressed, they are eliminated. Time is weaponized through delay. Entire generations are sentenced to die rather than be convinced. Replacement becomes preferable to reform. When people do not submit fast enough, the system does not slow down to understand them, it waits them out. Numbers asks the same question over and over again in different forms and different crises. What do you do with people who won't fall in line? And the answer is consistent: punishment, delay, death, and replacement. This is the moment where liberation mythology collapses into coercive control. The promise of freedom gives way to the reality of management. What began as rescue now operates as discipline. And once a system decides that people are the problem, it no longer needs to care whether they flourish, only whether they comply. Numbers is a book about managing disobedient bodies in the desert. It's not a journey story, it's an authoritarian disciplinary manual. One of the most revealing features of the book of Numbers is how often it stops to count people. On the surface, these censuses are presented as neutral administrative moments, necessary organization for a growing nation. But look closer at what's being counted, how it's being counted, and who actually matters in the tally. The census and numbers do not measure humanity, well being, or contribution to communal life. They measure bodies for deployment. People are reduced to numbers, tribes, and lineage categories. Worth is not tied to character, care, wisdom, or relational responsibility. It's tied to fighting capacity and bloodline. Adult males of military age are centered. Everyone else, women, children, elders, the disabled, exist at the margins of the data, if they exist at all. To be counted is not to be known, it's to be classified for use. This reshapes identity at a foundational level. When a system repeatedly asks, "How many are you?" instead of "Who are you?" people internalize a functional sense of self. Identity becomes instrumental. What role do you serve? What are you useful for? What category do you belong to? Individual dignity dissolves into assignment. A person's value is no longer intrinsic, it is logistical. Over time, this kind of framing trains people to see themselves and others through utility rather than humanity. Those who fit the system's needs feel temporarily validated. Those who don't become invisible or expendable. Self worth becomes contingent on usefulness, and fear grows around falling outside the categories that matter. When identity is reduced to function, vulnerability becomes dangerous. The census marks a shift from community to population management. A community knows its members through relationship, memory, and mutual care. A managed population is known through data. People are counted not to be supported, but to be organized, deployed when needed, punished when resistant, and replaced when inconvenient. The census enables distance. It allows leadership to make decisions about lives without ever encountering faces. This is how large scale control becomes possible. Once people are numbers, loss becomes abstract, delay becomes tolerable, and death becomes manageable. The census doesn't just record reality, it creates the conditions under which entire generations can be written off as acceptable casualties of the plan. And that's the quiet transformation Numbers introduces early on. Before dissent is punished, before rebellion is named, before judgment falls, people are first reduced. They are made legible to power, not meaningful to one another. Because in Numbers, people aren't known, they're tallied. One of the most consistent patterns in the book of Numbers is how human distress is interpreted. Hunger, fear, exhaustion, grief, and uncertainty are not treated as signals of unmet needs or environmental failure. They're framed as rebellion. The people are wandering in harsh conditions, facing scarcity and instability. Yet when they speak up, their suffering is moralized. Complaint itself becomes the offense. Now, this is a critical shift. The issue is no longer whether conditions are humane or sustainable. The issue becomes tone, posture, and loyalty. Legitimate needs, food, water, safety, clarity, are reframed as character flaws. The people are not hungry, they're faithless. They're not afraid, they're disobedient. Distress is no longer information, it's insubordination. Psychologically, this produces emotional suppression. When expressing discomfort leads to punishment, people learn to distrust their own distress signals. Hunger must be spiritualized, fear must be denied, grief must be silenced. Over time, individuals stop asking, "What do I need?" and start asking, "What am I allowed to feel?" The inner world becomes dangerous territory. Survival depends not on honesty, but on emotional compliance. This kind of conditioning fractures self trust. People learn that acknowledging pain makes them morally suspect, so they bury it. But buried distress doesn't disappear, it mutates. It shows up as anxiety, resentment, numbness, or explosive outbursts that are then used as further evidence of moral failure. The system creates the very instability it claims to punish. This reframing turns grievance into disloyalty. Once authority defines which emotions are acceptable, power no longer needs to address conditions, it only needs to police reactions. Leadership is insulated from accountability because any critique can be dismissed as rebellion. The problem is never the environment, it's the attitude of the people living in it. This is how control tightens without appearing cruel. Punishment is no longer framed as silencing dissent, it's framed as correcting character. People are disciplined not for what they do, but for how they feel. And once emotions themselves are regulated, resistance becomes almost impossible. You can't organize around needs you're not allowed to name. Numbers teaches this lesson relentlessly. If you're struggling, you're suspect. If you speak up, you're disloyal. If you suffer, it's because something is wrong with you. Because in Numbers, having a problem means that you are the problem. In the book of Numbers, divine response to dissent is not measured, instructional, or restorative. It is immediate and almost always lethal. Complaints are followed by fire. Fear is answered with plagues. Confusion is met with death. There is no meaningful space between expression and annihilation. The system does not pause to explain, it reacts to eradicate. What makes this especially destabilizing is the unpredictability. Punishment is not proportional to harm, nor is it consistently applied. Similar complaints receive wildly different outcomes, sometimes rebuke, sometimes mass death. The people are never given a stable framework for understanding consequences. They cannot learn, they can only fear. The rules are not transparent, they are enforced through shock. This produces fear based obedience. When punishment is both severe and unpredictable, trust collapses. People stop asking what is right and start asking what is safest. Hypervigilance replaces moral reasoning. Every word, emotion, or question becomes a potential threat to survival itself. The nervous system is trained for danger, not growth. Obedience is no longer relational, it's reflexive. This kind of environment destroys the possibility of internalized values. People do not obey because they understand or agree, they obey because they are afraid. Compliance becomes a survival strategy rather than a moral choice. Over time, this erodes agency. Individuals learn that thinking, feeling, or questioning carries lethal risk, so silence becomes wisdom and passivity becomes virtue. Sociologically, terror becomes a governance tool. Authority does not need to persuade, justify, or repair. It only needs to remind the population of what happens when displeasure is expressed. Uncertainty itself becomes a mechanism of control. When people don't know where the line is, they stay far from it. Fear does the work that explanation never could. This is a classic authoritarian pattern. Unpredictable punishment keeps people compliant because compliance feels safer than understanding. The goal is not moral formation, it's behavioral containment. People are not shaped, they are managed. Stability is maintained not through trust, but through threat. Numbers does not depict a community being guided toward maturity. It depicts a population being conditioned to survive authority. Because in numbers, correction isn't guidance, it's extermination. The episode of the spies in the book of Numbers marks a decisive turn in how reality itself is handled. 12 scouts are sent to assess the land ahead. Their report is mixed. The land is fertile, but the opposition is strong. Now, this is not sabotage, it's honest risk assessment. Yet the narrative reframes realism as rebellion. Only the report that aligns with divine optimism is permitted. Accuracy is irrelevant if it threatens momentum. What makes this moment so revealing is that the fear is not punished because it paralyzes the people, it's punished because it contradicts authority. The problem is not that the spies lie, it's that they tell the truth in a way that complicates the plan. The system doesn't ask whether the concerns are valid, it asks whether the people are loyal. Once that line is crossed, dissent becomes treason. Psychologically, this trains reality denial. People learn that acknowledging danger is morally suspect and that doubt itself is a failure of character. Fear, one of the most basic human survival signals, is reframed as sin. Instead of being integrated and addressed, it's suppressed. Over time, this creates a population that distrusts its own perceptions. If seeing clearly is punished, blindness becomes safer than honesty. This dynamic also collapses moral nuance. Courage is no longer the capacity to face danger with clarity, it's reduced to performative confidence. Faith becomes indistinguishable from denial. People are rewarded not for wisdom or preparedness, but for affirming whatever preserves authority's narrative. The inner life is reshaped to prioritize alignment over accuracy. The spy's story enforces groupthink. Truth becomes whatever maintains cohesion and forward motion under command. Alternative perspectives are not debated, they're eliminated and demonized. The community learns that disagreement threatens survival, not because it causes harm, but because it destabilizes control. Once realism is criminalized, policy becomes insulated from correction, and catastrophe becomes inevitable. This is how authoritarian systems protect themselves by redefining truth as loyalty and fear as betrayal. When only optimism aligned with power is allowed, leaders are never wrong, they are only insufficiently obeyed. The cost is paid by the people who are no longer permitted to see clearly. In numbers, the lesson is unmistakable. Realism is rebellion. The 40 years of wandering portrayed in the book of Numbers are often framed as a neutral consequence of disobedience, but structurally they function as punishment through delay. An entire generation is sentenced to die in the desert, not because of individual crimes, but because the population as a whole failed to align quickly enough. Dialogue ends, explanation stops. Instead of addressing fear, disagreement, or risk, the system simply waits people out. Time itself becomes the instrument of discipline. What's striking is the absence of moral engagement. There's no attempt to resolve concerns, adapt strategy, or incorporate feedback. Delay replaces dialogue, death replaces persuasion. The message is clear: if you don't submit on schedule, you'll not be reasoned with, you'll be replaced. The problem is not behavior that can be corrected, it is people who cannot be trusted to comply fast enough. This produces learned helplessness. When outcomes are fixed regardless of effort, initiative becomes pointless. Hope turns dangerous because hope invites expectation, and expectation invites disappointment and possibly punishment. People learn that endurance, not agency, is the safest posture. Survival depends not on growth or insight, but on quietly waiting until authority decides the future has arrived. Over time, this erodes motivation and self trust. A population trained to wonder without progress internalizes stagnation as normal. Dreams narrow, risk taking disappears. The safest aspiration becomes simply lasting long enough to see the next generation take over. When time is weaponized, imagination becomes a liability. Sociologically, the wandering normalizes generational punishment. Children grow up watching their parents die for decisions made long before they had agency. Responsibility is diffused across time, making accountability impossible. Leaders are never required to answer for failure, they simply outlast dissent. Delay becomes a governance strategy, one that preserves authority by exhausting opposition rather than engaging it. This is a familiar political pattern. When systems cannot justify themselves, they stall. When leaders cannot persuade, they postpone. When accountability threatens power, time is used to erode resistance. Numbers sanctifies this tactic by framing it as divine wisdom rather than institutional avoidance. In the end, the wilderness is not a test of faith, it's a holding pattern enforced by mortality. Progress is deferred until the problem people are gone, and the lesson settles in quietly but firmly. In Numbers, even time is used as a weapon. As the book of Numbers continues to unfold, collective punishment stops being exceptional and becomes routine. Entire groups suffer for the actions of individuals. Fire breaks out in the camp. Plagues spread through the population. Death follows not personal guilt, but proximity. Innocence offers no protection. Being nearby is enough. Responsibility is no longer individual, it's contagious. What makes this system especially corrosive is its predictability. Punishment does not require investigation, intent, or proportionality. It moves automatically through the group. This trains people to understand themselves not as moral agents, but as risk factors. Your safety depends less on what you do and more on who you're near. Moral life becomes a matter of distance management rather than ethical engagement. This produces guilt by proximity. People learn that association itself is dangerous. Trust erodes because closeness carries risk. When one person's failure can destroy many, silence becomes survival. Speaking up, questioning, or even showing solidarity can mark you as a liability. The safest response to wrongdoing, then, is not accountability, it's withdrawal. Over time, this reshapes emotional behavior. Empathy becomes costly. Loyalty is measured not by care, but by compliance. People stop intervening when harm happens because involvement increases exposure. Moral courage, then, is punished, not rewarded. The system trains people to look away not because they are cruel, but because they are afraid. Collective punishment creates self policing communities. Authority no longer needs to watch constantly. Fear does the work. Trust me, I grew up in one of those communities. Neighbors monitor neighbors, families regulate members, social pressure enforces conformity more efficiently than formal discipline ever could. Solidarity weakens because unity increases vulnerability. Survival depends on isolation, then, and not cooperation. This is how population control stabilizes itself. When punishment spreads indiscriminately, people internalize surveillance. Order is maintained not through justice or trust, but through shared anxiety. The community holds itself hostage to avoid attracting attention from power. Numbers makes this lesson unmistakable. One mistake can poison everything. The episode of Cora's rebellion in the Book of Numbers makes the structure of authority unmistakably clear. Cora and his followers question the concentration of power in Moses and Aaron's leadership. Their challenge is not violent, and it's not framed as an attempt to overthrow the community. It is a dispute over legitimacy and shared authority. The response, however, is immediate and absolute. The earth opens and swallows the dissenters alive. Debate is not answered, it's erased. What matters here is not the outcome, but the precedent. Questioning leadership is refined as rebellion against God Himself. Authority is no longer accountable to people, it's fused with divinity. Once that fusion occurs, moral reasoning shuts down. There's no space left to ask whether leadership is fair, effective, or just. To question is to sin. To disagree is to invite annihilation. Psychologically, this creates a profound internal conflict. If authority equals God, then doubt becomes dangerous, not just socially, but existentially. People learn to suppress critical thought to preserve safety and belonging. Conscience is overridden by fear. Over time, individuals internalize obedience as virtue and reinterpret silence as faithfulness. Moral agency then is traded for survival. This dynamic also teaches learned submission. When dissent is met with catastrophic punishment, people stop distinguishing between healthy disagreement and treason. All resistance collapses into the same category. The safest posture becomes unquestioning compliance, not because leaders are always right, but because they are untouchable. Cora's rebellion establishes an explicitly anti democratic structure. Power is centralized, insulated, and protected by sacred violence. Leadership cannot be challenged, reformed, or replaced through dialogue. The system does not correct itself, it defends itself. Authority becomes self justifying, and accountability disappears altogether. This is how authoritarian systems immunize themselves against critique. By framing dissent as existential threat, they ensure that power remains unquestioned. Numbers does not merely describe this structure, it sanctifies it. The lesson is blunt and unforgettable. In numbers, disagreements gets buried. It's kind of like snitches get stitches. Throughout the entirety of the book of Numbers, violence is not treated as a tragic failure of leadership, it's treated as an effective tool of restoring order. When tension arises, when dissent spreads, when boundaries are crossed, the solution is repeatedly the same: killing. Violence is framed not as chaos, but as purification. Remove the offenders, and the system stabilizes. What makes this especially disturbing is how routine the pattern becomes. Death is no longer exceptional, it's procedural. Executions, plagues, and divine strikes are deployed to resolve internal conflict, not external threat. The community is taught that harmony is achieved not through understanding, not through negotiation, not even through repair, but through elimination. Problems are not worked through, they are cut out. Psychologically, this produces moral numbing. When violence is consistently framed as righteous and necessary, emotional resistance weakens. People learn to disengage empathy in order to survive. Obedience overrides compassion because compassion risks identification with the condemned. Over time, individuals stop asking whether killing is justified and begin asking only whether it is authorized. This dynamic reshapes moral intuition. Violence becomes a legitimate expression of care for the group. Killing is reframed as protection. The line between safety and cruelty blurs because both are achieved through the same means. Once obedience is prioritized over empathy, the suffering of others becomes easier to ignore, especially when that suffering is presented as cleansing. Sociologically, this is how authoritarian systems maintain unity. Internal violence enforces conformity more efficiently than persuasion ever could. Fear does the work of cohesion. Blood becomes the glue that holds the group together. Unity is no longer built through trust or shared values, it is enforced through threat. Numbers does not hide this logic. It teaches that peace is not the absence of violence, but the successful application of it. Order is restored when those who disrupt it are removed. And once that lesson is absorbed, violence no longer looks like failure, it looks like leadership. The message settles in with chilling clarity. In numbers, peace is achieved by removal, which leads us to replacement theology. In the book of Numbers, the logic of replacement becomes explicit. God repeatedly expresses willingness, even intention, to replace the people themselves. The problem is not specific behaviors that can be corrected, it's the population. Loyalty matters more than humanity. When obedience falters, reform is not the goal, attrition is. This marks a profound shift in how human worth is framed. People are no longer treated as ends in themselves capable of growth, learning, or repair, they're treated as provisional. A generation can be written off entirely, not because each individual is beyond redemption, but because the group as a whole is deemed inefficient. The solution is not transformation, it's turnover. This installs conditional worth. Belonging becomes contingent. Safety becomes temporary. People learn that they are tolerated only as long as they perform correctly. Failure does not invite support, it invites replacement. Over time, this erodes self trust and dignity. When worth is conditional, people stop seeing themselves as intrinsically valuable and start seeing themselves as expendable. This also reshapes motivation. If authority is willing to discard you, survival becomes the primary goal. Moral growth gives way to risk avoidance. People learn to conform not because they believe, but because they fear being erased. Loyalty becomes a survival strategy rather than a shared commitment. Replacement theology treats populations as interchangeable. Authority is preserved not by investing in people, but by outlasting them. Leaders do not adapt to the community is cycled until it fits. This logic is foundational to authoritarian systems. Power survives people, not the other way around. Human lives become resources to be spent, not relationships to be cultivated. The wilderness becomes a waiting room for death. Progress is delayed until the problem generation is gone. The future is not built with the people who struggled, it's handed to those who never question. This is not leadership development, it's demographic strategy. Numbers makes the lesson unmistakable. God does not reform people, he waits for them to die. And that, my friends, speaks volumes. The book of Numbers is protected not because it inspires moral clarity, but because it stabilizes authority. If Numbers falls, obedience through fear collapses with it. The logic that says people must comply because punishment is immediate, unpredictable, and lethal loses its sacred backing. Fear stops looking like wisdom. Submission stops looking like virtue. Once that happens, sacred punishment loses legitimacy. Plagues, public executions, delays, and mass death can no longer be reframed as discipline or divine necessity. They have to be evaluated ethically by harm, proportionality, and accountability. And when punishment is evaluated instead of assumed, authority can no longer act without explanation. Power must justify itself, not merely assert itself. If numbers is questioned, authority becomes accountable. Leaders can no longer hide behind divine mandate when decisions fail or people suffer. Dissent stops being rebellion and starts being human again, an expression of fear, care, grief, or concern rather than treason. Questioning becomes part of collective reasoning instead of a threat to order. This is destabilizing for systems built on control. When fear no longer governs behavior, When people begin to trust their perceptions again, they ask why. They notice patterns. They recognize injustice. The internal leash loosens. Obedience becomes a choice rather than a reflex. This is why number endures. It teaches institutions how to survive dissatisfaction, how to delay accountability, how to suppress dissent, and how to replace people instead of reforming systems. It offers a blueprint for outlasting criticism by outlasting critics. When populations are disposable, authority never has to change. Numbers is not preserved because it forms healthy communities. It's preserved because it teaches power how to endure. Numbers survives because it teaches institutions how to outlast people. Genesis breaks you, Exodus controls you, Leviticus monitors you, and Numbers disciplines you. This is not a spiritual journey, it's systemic self depletion. Thanks for sticking around to the end. If you want a deeper dive into the book of Numbers, last year I designed two in depth content guides going through the first 20 chapters of Numbers from a humanistic lens enabled by a sociological comprehension of scriptural impact in the Western world. Both guides are a shining example of the work we're doing through DLDD World Group and Bridge City to help people find reconstruction after deconstruction. Make sure to check it out. The link is in the description. And if you want a deeper dive into intentional community, become a member of Bridge City by joining the global campus. Our community is people centric, forward thinking, and life affirming, which means that we gather, we grow, we give, and we grind because people matter and are worth the effort. We have empowering weekend experiences, engaging weekly discussions, and even entertaining activities like game nights and movie nights that give our members room to just breathe and be themselves in the moment. But don't get it twisted. We're not just having a good time, we're doing good work. Lives are being transformed and elevated through our Sunday sessions. Lives are being supported through community organized food drives and blood drives. And lives are reclaiming meaning through connection and collaboration. We're not just building a bridge, we're being the bridge to a better way to connect, a better way to build, and ultimately a better way to live. If you're tired of being disconnected and disrespected, I invite you to join us in co creating better ways to connect. The links are in the description. As always, thank you for joining me today. And until next time, keep rising.